She stood tall, sharp-witted, and ready to make a point. The spotlight was hers, and with a practiced mix of sarcasm and confidence, she turned her attention to the man sitting across from her. The room buzzed with anticipation. With a sly smirk, she leaned into the microphone and started picking apart the way he talked. Slow, deliberate, thick with a southern drawl that echoed like something from an old country courthouse. It wasn't just the way he spoke that drew her fire. It was what he represented in her mind. To her, he seemed like a relic of a bygone era, someone clinging to tradition, speaking in metaphors and sayings that felt foreign to a fast-talking, city-born crowd. And so, she mocked it. The moment was hers. A few chuckles broke out among the audience, a ripple of laughter she took as a cue to press harder. She tossed in another jab, this time with a bit more bite. It wasn't a direct insult, more of a casual dismissal dressed up as clever commentary. She leaned back, satisfied. It was the kind of moment that typically played well online, a quick soundbite, viral material. But what she didn't see was the shift in the room, the subtle pause, the tension that began to build beneath the surface. It wasn't that people disagreed with her outright. Many didn't know what to think yet. But there was something unsettling in the way she laughed, as if simplicity and sincerity were now synonymous with stupidity. Something in her tone gave people pause, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. She wasn't expecting what came next. No one was. Then, without rushing, he stood, not hurried, not flustered, calm, measured, like a man who'd been underestimated more than once and knew how to use it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words came slow and steady, painted with the same southern warmth she had just finished ridiculing. But this time, there was a weight behind them. Each sentence landed with the quiet power of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't address the mockery directly. He didn't need to mention her name or her words. Instead, he spoke in parables, in carefully chosen phrases that seemed simple on the surface, but underneath were layered with insight. Every metaphor, every turn of phrase, wrapped around a deeper truth that didn't need flashing lights or fast delivery to make an impact. His speech wasn't polished in the way hers was. It was raw and rooted, the kind of voice you'd hear at a kitchen table or a small-town church on a Sunday morning. But it carried more than charm, it carried experience. The room began to shift. What had been laughter just moments ago turned into silence. Eyes that had been fixed on her with admiration now turned toward him with curiosity. There was no need for theatrics. The simplicity of his presence was enough. And that, in itself, was the answer to the earlier ridicule. As he continued, he spoke not like a politician, but like someone who knew what it was to be ignored, dismissed, counted out. His stories wove in references to literature, to history, to life lessons earned the hard way, and for every soft drawl that left his lips, there was a sharp edge of intelligence that couldn't be denied. He was teaching without preaching, pushing back without ever raising his hand. People began nodding, not just out of agreement, but out of respect. The same voice that had been mocked as outdated suddenly sounded timeless, and what she had treated as a punchline became the very thing that earned him the room. What started as a performance meant to belittle turned into a lesson in restraint and poise. While she had gone for the laugh, he went for the truth. And in doing so, he didn't just respond, he elevated the entire conversation, without ever speaking her name, without ever sinking to insult, and without changing a single syllable of the voice she'd tried to make a joke. The air had shifted. What had begun as a light-hearted jab from across the room suddenly teetered into something deeper. The moment hung there, awkward, uncertain. She had taken her shot, a clever line meant to earn a laugh at someone else's expense. It worked briefly. Laughter trickled out, polite at first, then a bit more confident. She smirked, satisfied. It was the kind of line that would get clipped, tweeted, and praised. But across the room, he simply sat still. Then, he stood. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. No slamming fists or rolling eyes. Just a slow rise, like a man who had waited for his turn and knew he didn't need to fight for attention, because once he had it, he never lost it. The room quieted, not because anyone was told to, but because his silence spoke louder than her words ever could. He walked to the microphone with the kind of calm you can't fake. Not the calm of someone trying to win a debate, but the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you come from. He didn't smile, but his eyes held something more dangerous than anger: clarity. Then he began to speak. No venom, no sarcasm, just plain talk, carefully delivered, with the ease of someone who'd spent years letting people underestimate him. His voice, deliberate and slow, wrapped the room in stillness. People leaned forward, not out of courtesy, but curiosity. The tone was folksy, maybe even old-fashioned, but there was nothing simple about what came out of his mouth. He started with a story, one that at first seemed disconnected from what had just happened. It was about an old farmer, or maybe it was about a school teacher. No one was quite sure. That was part of the genius. It sounded casual, almost offhanded, but every sentence was crafted like a blade hidden in a walking stick. The story was layered, and by the time he reached the end of it, people realized he hadn't just told a tale. He had made a point so sharp, so precise, it left no room for rebuttal. He quoted old philosophers, dropped in references to legal history, even quoted Shakespeare, but not like a show-off. More like someone who actually lived with those books, not just studied them to win arguments. And he wove those quotes into something meaningful, not just for his own defense, but for everyone listening. He wasn't just responding to a slight, he was holding a mirror up to the entire room. What made it so powerful wasn't that he clapped back with fire. It was that he didn't. He never once mentioned her by name, never repeated what she said. He didn't have to. He just let the weight of his words stack higher and higher until it was clear. He wasn't the one on trial anymore. The laughter that had followed her jab had dissolved completely. In its place was a hush so thick it almost buzzed. At one point, he paused and looked out into the audience. There was no smugness, no arrogance, just a quiet certainty. And then, as if he knew exactly what the audience needed before they did, he delivered the line. The one that would get replayed, the one that would show up in headlines, in tweets, in memes. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it cut through every insult, every stereotype, every assumption like a hot knife through butter. And then, he stopped. No grand finale, no mic drop, just silence. He turned and walked back to his seat as if he had simply said what needed to be said and nothing more. The crowd erupted, not in a cheer fueled by spectacle, but in applause born from something real. Respect. Not just for what he said, but for how he said it. It wasn't a counterattack. It was a reminder that dignity speaks louder than mockery, that substance outweighs flair, and that sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that... It started as a small moment in a crowded room, nothing out of the ordinary, just another heated exchange during a public event. Cameras were rolling, reporters scribbling, and the internet already buzzing with speculation before anyone had said a word. Then came the jab, a sharp, sarcastic line wrapped in a joke but dipped in condescension. The kind of comment designed to entertain more than inform, built not on argument but attitude. It wasn't just an attack, it was a performance. The tone, the timing, even the smirk afterward, it was meant to go viral. And at first, it did. Clips of the moment hit social media within minutes. Snippets edited for punch, the laughter looped on repeat, headlines popped up. Savage! She ends him in seconds. It looked like a win, at least for the moment. Supporters cheered online, piling on with memes and hashtags. The message was simple. The old guard had been humiliated, and the future belonged to the quick-tongued and the camera-ready. But then something unexpected happened. The full video surfaced. Not just the 30-second clip, but the long version. The moment after the laugh, when the tone shifted. When he responded, not with outrage or mockery, but with something far more potent: authenticity. The internet, so quick to crown victors, suddenly paused. People started watching the other side of the exchange, not because they were looking for a rebuttal, but because something about his demeanor after the insult felt different. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't rehearsed, it was real. In a world full of shouting, he didn't raise his voice. In a culture addicted to quick wins, he played the long game. His words, slow and clear, weren't delivered to go viral. They were built to be remembered. No flashy retorts, no biting comebacks. Just truth, told plainly. And sometimes, that's more powerful than any insult. The longer people watched, the more the mood shifted. The narrative began to flip. Comments flooded in, not mocking him but praising him. Viewers who had laughed at first started to reconsider. They saw the dignity in his tone, the patience in his pacing, the restraint he showed when many would have chosen rage. And somewhere in that shift, the story changed. The hashtags that once mocked him now praised him. Tweets once filled with sarcasm were replaced with respect. Grace under fire. Wisdom speaks. People shared the video not because it was funny, but because it felt rare. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about character. Commentators who had once dismissed him began reconsidering. Podcasts replayed the exchange in full. Pundits who usually thrived on conflict were forced to acknowledge the skill of someone who knew how to lead without shouting, the elegance of answering cruelty with clarity. And in homes across the country, people shared the video with captions like, "This is how you respond. This is real leadership. This is how my grandfather used to speak." Even those who didn't agree with his views found themselves nodding, not at the politics, but at the poise. It reminded people of something they'd forgotten in the noise: civility, humility, the quiet strength of knowing who you are and not needing to prove it with volume. And suddenly, the moment didn't belong to the person who struck first. It belonged to the one who didn't flinch, the one who stood calmly and let the truth speak louder than any insult could. What had started as a humiliation turned into a masterclass in composure. Not because it was scripted, not because it was showy, but because it was real. The viral moment people thought they had witnessed at the beginning wasn't the one that endured. The legacy of that exchange belonged to the part most people missed at first, the quiet response that demanded attention without ever asking for it. It was a reminder, shared over and over again, that sometimes the most powerful response is the one that doesn't try to win the moment but earns the respect of a lifetime. The room was still, not because anyone had asked for silence, but because something about the moment had shifted. The tension just minutes ago, filled with laughter and jabs, now felt different, like everyone could sense that something more important was about to be said. It wasn't rehearsed, and it didn't come with fanfare. No one shouted, no one raised a fist, no dramatic pause or rallying cry, just a man who slowly rose and began to speak, not to retaliate, but to remind. The voice wasn't polished in the way that commands headlines. It had a texture to it, one shaped by years of experience, the kind of voice that carried stories instead of sound bites. The accent, once mocked as a relic of a slower time, now rang with clarity. It wasn't that the words were flashy, it was that they carried weight. They meant something, and the crowd felt it immediately. He began not with anger, but with calm. He didn't address the insult directly. That would have been too easy. Instead, he reached into something deeper, something people weren't expecting. He started talking about where he came from, not to boast, but to give context. He spoke of values, of hard work, of things learned on front porches and dirt roads. The stories weren't grand, but they were real, and in them people could hear echoes of their own lives, struggles, failures, triumphs no one clapped for. He didn't try to outshout or outjoke the person who had tried to belittle him. Instead, he quietly built something stronger than a comeback. He built credibility. Each sentence added another layer, not just to his character, but to the moment itself. He quoted thinkers and writers, old ones, not the names most people. Dropped to sound smart, but the kind that actually say something when you need it most. He didn't use their words to impress. He used them to teach. Somewhere in the middle of it, the atmosphere shifted entirely. People who had come expecting theater found themselves leaning forward, not for drama, but for substance. It was a change they didn't see coming. The same man they had just laughed at was now holding their full attention, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. He talked about intelligence, not the kind measured by degrees or accolades, but the kind that comes from living, from listening, from failing and getting back up. He didn't have to prove anything. That was the power. He didn't come armed with slick lines or clever barbs. He just brought truth, and in that moment, it was more than enough. People weren't just listening, they were reevaluating. Everything that had been said before, the mockery, the assumptions, the labels, they started to fade. In their place was something undeniable: respect. Not because he asked for it, but because he modeled it. When he paused, the silence wasn't awkward. It was necessary. Like the room needed space to absorb what had just been said. No one moved, no one whispered. Even the cameras, so quick to capture chaos, seemed unsure of what to do with this kind of stillness. Then came the line. Just one. It wasn't loud or sharp. It didn't call anyone out by name, but it struck like lightning. It was the kind of line that cuts through noise, not because it's flashy, but because it's true. And when he said it, you could feel the shift ripple through the room. Some gasped, some smiled, some just stared, but no one laughed. What made it land wasn't just the words themselves, but the way they were delivered. With grace, with strength, with a deep, unshakable understanding that some things don't need to be shouted to be heard. He didn't rise to meet the insult. He stood above it. And when he finished, there was no need to declare a winner. The reaction said it all. People stood, not out of obligation, but out of admiration. The same crowd that had chuckled earlier now clapped with a kind of reverence rarely seen in rooms like that. He hadn't just responded. He had redefined what it meant to respond, not with anger, not with ego, but with a kind of wisdom that silences the loudest critics because it doesn't come from pride, it comes from knowing exactly who you are. As the final echoes of his words settled into the room, something remarkable became clear. This wasn't just a moment. It was a turning point. The atmosphere, once thick with arrogance and mockery, had shifted into something quieter, more reverent. The man hadn't raised his voice, hadn't barked insults, hadn't thrown verbal punches. He didn't need to. His strength was rooted in stillness, in the unshakable confidence of someone who had weathered real storms, not just internet spats or political showdowns. People in the audience weren't clapping out of politeness. They were clapping because they had just witnessed something rare. A moment where humility outshone ego, where substance outlasted style, where a calm, steady voice reminded everyone in that room and beyond that real intelligence isn't always loud, and real wisdom doesn't need applause to be valid. It just is. In an age dominated by hot takes, viral clips, and carefully curated personas, there's something deeply refreshing about someone who refuses to play along. Someone who doesn't react with flash but responds with depth. Someone who doesn't fall into the trap of showmanship because they've built their life on something firmer than image, on values, on principle, on truth earned the hard way. And that's what resonated the most. People didn't walk away talking about who won or lost. They talked about what it meant to carry yourself with dignity when dignity is under attack. They talked about how rare it is to hear someone speak from the heart, not from a script. And most of all, they talked about how powerful it is when someone lets their character speak louder than their critics. It wasn't just about a comeback. It wasn't about clapping back or owning the moment. It was about showing in real time what grace under pressure looks like, about revealing the kind of depth that can't be faked, about proving that sometimes the strongest people in the room are the ones who don't need to shout to be heard. That moment will live on, not because it was loud, but because it was lasting. Not because it generated noise, but because it revealed truth. In that quiet, measured response, something undeniable was laid bare. That a steady voice rooted in wisdom can still silence the chaos, that real strength comes not from overpowering others, but from rising above them, and that sometimes the most unforgettable moments come not when someone strikes back, but when they stand tall and let the world see who they truly are. And in that moment,